Thank you for being here. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you all today in the room and then those listening in online as well. My name is Devin, as you saw from that wonderful introduction. I'm a regulatory and sustainability expert with Assent. And today we're going to discuss ESG in the supply chain and how we can use this as an opportunity to move beyond compliance. All right. So I'd like to break our conversation today into three main parts. I want to talk about why ESG matters in supply chain, how integrating ESG risk management into your procurement process can help you stay ahead of requirements and build resiliency, and what you can do today to take a more holistic approach to supply chain management with ESG. Sound good? Okay, so why ESG matters in the supply chain. I always like to take a step back and look at the big picture in order to establish some common context for our conversation. And today, that conversation doesn't actually start with ESG. It starts with sustainability. So sustainability is a term you've all heard before, with a variety of definitions and even broader implications regarding its meaning. The definition that I'd like to work from today is what you see here. As simply put as possible, sustainability is about how you continue a process indefinitely. In the context of business, we're looking at sustainability to help understand and address barriers to your organization's ability to continue to do what it does indefinitely. Business has a strong foundation of understanding economically what is required to stay operational. Bottom line, cash flow, price of materials, cost of labor, etc. But that doesn't paint the whole picture, nor does financial profitability guarantee your organization's ability to continue to operate indefinitely. There are environmental and social constraints that have not found their way into the financial accounting methods being used to measure success in business today. Now, this is where the difference between price and cost comes into the equation. We know the price of manufacturing a particular widget, but what about these environmental and social costs that are not as easy to quantify with a financial figure? How do you put a price on the long-term negative health impacts faced by a community exposed to toxic byproducts of manufacturing? Or the opportunity cost of unrealized human potential when children leave school early in order to join the workforce to help support their families. These are referred to as externalities, and this is why you'll often see sustainability talked about as a balance between people, profit, and planet, also known as triple bottom line, as you see represented by the graphic here. We've seen the conversation around sustainability explode in recent years. There's an overwhelming consensus in the global community that these externalized costs of doing business are not only relevant, but threaten our long-term viability on the planet. Action must be taken. We need to start measuring success in business beyond quarterly profits. We see this through aspirational global collaborations and commitments, such as the UN Global Compact, Science-Based Target Initiative. We also see this through a more tangible bottom-up approach. We're attempting to address specific externalities in the form of new regulations. For example, the issue of forced labor in Xinjiang province was deemed to be an unacceptable cost of doing business and codified into US federal law recently with UFLPA. Ross is another example a lot of you are probably familiar with, where the EU decided that the negative impacts surrounding the disposal of toxic chemicals in electronics was untenable. The thing about these kinds of regulations is that they're not going away. In fact, we're seeing a rapid growth trajectory for regulations in both the US and EU. While the scope and focus of these kinds of regulations, of course, vary greatly, and individually add to the frustration facing businesses looking to comply and compete in a global marketplace, the common thread worth pointing out here is that the intent of many of these regulations is to specifically address some forms of externalities and bring us more in line with a pattern of sustainable manufacturing and consumption. As regulations broaden in scope and we try to address more externalities, the number of affected companies also increases. The interesting thing about this increase is the ripple effect initiated by these regulations, because the mandatory due diligence obligations of in-scope businesses require supply chain insight and engagement. And why is that? Because unfortunately for your organizations and your organization's ability to understand and manage the externalities driving many regulatory requirements today, they tend to occur outside your four walls. The UN Principles for Responsible Investment conducted studies that have shown that for most verticals, the majority of impacts take place in the supply chain. Most manufacturing sectors are looking at between 70 and 90% of their environmental impact occurring upstream. So pretty much no matter where you are located in the supply chain, you have downstream stakeholders, such as customers, investors, regulators, etc., who are requiring disclosure related to impacts, and upstream stakeholders who you must engage with to get this information. Oh, and by the way, ignorance of these impacts won't preclude your organization from financial or reputational risks of bad actors in your supply chain, or the implications of not being able to report on performance to your stakeholders, even if your business isn't in the direct scope of a particular regulation. Lucky you, right? Okay, so the question you all probably have for me right now, what does this have to do with ESG? I do have a point. I promise I'm getting to it. Given what we've outlined so far regarding the nature of sustainability, externalities, and the correlating complex and continually shifting landscape of regulatory compliance evolving in response, what is the connection to ESG? ESG, for those of you unfamiliar with the acronym, stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and refers to a criteria used to assess a company's behavior in these impact areas, and was initially used by some investors to screen potential investments. Credit to our friends in the finance industry who first coined the term. Turns out that they noticed that businesses who have strong programs in place and perform well against these E, S, and G criteria offer lower risk and make for safer long-term investments. In recent years, we've seen ESG explode onto the scene because of its ability to help quantify these externalities that we haven't historically considered and that we so desperately need. Thanks to this, we see ESG trending as regulators, investors, and customers have begun to align around ESG as how we can communicate performance and expectations in a common language. There's an old saying out there, that which gets measured gets managed. And one of the big benefits of ESG is that it represents our latest and greatest attempt to quantify these externalities, these non-financial risks, so that we can start factoring this into the cost of doing business. This has been an extraordinarily long-winded way of saying that ESG criteria can be implemented to understand and manage your organization's exposure to these non-financial risks or externalities upstream in your supply chain in a more holistic manner in order to meet the mandatory due diligence requirements your company faces and needs to report to downstream stakeholders. Okay, so we've got the why ESG matters and supply chain piece down. Now let's talk about how integrating ESG as a risk management tool into your supply chain engagements can help your organization build resiliency and stay ahead of regulations and reporting obligations as we continue our beautiful, imperfect push towards a better, more sustainable future. All right, let's talk about this graphic on the left side of the slide here. You may be familiar with some or all of these regulations, reporting frameworks, what I refer to affectionately as word salad. In the green. The idea here is to represent the growing complexity of requirements that your organizations are facing or could be facing in the near future. We've established that a lot of the impacts that these are trying to highlight or remedy occur in your supply chain. And I'm sure my procurement friends here are already facing the mounting pressure to react to each of these individual obligations as they bubble up. But what if we try a more holistic approach? We know the bulk of these drivers relate to environmental and social externalities. I want us to think about how we can utilize ESG as a lens to identify and manage supplier performance against environmental, social, and governance criteria, and how you can benefit your organizations by taking a top-down approach in reducing risk and facilitating compliance with regulatory requirements on ESG topics, and maintain your ability to meet your stakeholder expectations now and in the future. I see this top-down approach delivering value to your organization in three key facets. The first is reducing risk. Coming back to that definition of sustainability as the ability to continue a process indefinitely, and recognizing ESG criteria as risk indicators, i.e. risk to continuing your business's process indefinitely. By starting to integrate ESG into your supplier management, you're signaling to them the key impact areas that have been identified as material to your organization. You also begin to baseline your supply chain's maturity on these topics and subsequently your own risk exposure. Number two is getting ahead. We can't possibly know or anticipate every regulatory requirement that will come, but we do have a good idea of the major impact areas that haven't been traditionally accounted for and that are driving a lot of the compliance regulations that we see today. ESG criteria is helping to standardize and quantify performance and risk in these impact areas. So utilizing ESG with your suppliers will help establish a common understanding of your expectations of them, how their performance is being assessed, and provide a roadmap for how to mature and improve their programs over time. Let's outline a specific example here. UFLPA is a recent regulation that has sent a lot of companies scrambling to understand what risk they might be exposed to and require them to immediately respond and implement due diligence measures in their supply chain to ensure that in-scope goods do not have ties to forced labor in Xinjiang province. But what about the next instance of forced labor in a particular region? What if you've already been assessing your supplier's performance on social criteria, such as labor rights, within your procurement process as a part of the supplier onboarding? You're already ahead of the curve in understanding where your supply chain's biggest risks are, and armed with that data, you can proactively manage your risk to forced labor holistically, rather than starting from scratch in response to a particular new regulation, and set yourself up to manage future iterations dealing with related externalities. Finally, driving continuous improvement and resilience. By engaging your suppliers from the beginning of the procurement process with ESG, provides a useful framework for supplier development over time, so you can work with them as partners to mature their own ESG programs and performance. This commitment towards working together can reduce supplier turnover, and since your suppliers are more holistically managing ESG topics, they themselves are more resilient in the face of an increasingly complicated global marketplace and will be better positioned to continue to support you in the future. This in turn helps build your own resiliency, not just by reducing risks or disruptions in your own supply chain, but also by improving your organization's ability to respond to your key stakeholders. Sounds great, right? But what do you need to do in order to effectively engage your suppliers holistically with ESG and build that resiliency? So there's a catch with what I'm proposing to you all today. In order to build that resiliency and keep ahead of the curve, it's going to require work. The engagement has to go beyond simple checking the box exercises and document compliance. My company has been in the supply chain sustainability space for over a decade, and we've identified 3 key program components that are vital to success with this approach. The first component to a successful supply chain ESG program is supplier intelligence. Coming back to that idea of that which gets measured gets managed, it's important to engage your supply chain and get an honest assessment of where they're at today. This can be done through both direct and indirect engagement, trust but verify. It's important not to punish or shame your suppliers and force the kind of check-the-box exercises. Sooner or later, that will catch up with both of you. It's important to foster education and collaboration, which brings us to the second point. Second is about supplier development. Resiliency is built through engagement and collaboration. It's important to work with your suppliers to help them grow with you over time. It's essential that your supplier partners understand why they're being asked the questions that they are and how they can go about meeting your expectations now and in the future. The foundational knowledge to build out robust ESG programs needs to be built and shared, both through feedback and sharing of resources and guidance. Help your suppliers to help you. Finally, guidance and expertise. The regulatory landscape is constantly evolving and shifting, and while actively managing ESG in your supply chain can put you ahead, it's still imperative that you regularly keep an eye on what key drivers are emerging so you can be ready for what's next. Your suppliers are leaning on you to clearly communicate what your needs are now and in the future, so be prepared to keep a trusted eye down the road, either through internal resources or strategic partners. If you're able to start doing these 3 things while using ESG to engage with your suppliers, you're well on your way to moving from a reactive to a more proactive and resilient supply chain. Okay, so to summarize, 1, externalities are unaccounted for barriers or risks to sustainability that most often occur in your supply chain. Business hasn't traditionally been able to quantify these, but we've hit a tipping point in the global community and are realizing that these costs can no longer be ignored. 2, regulators and stakeholder pressures are shedding a light and working to address these externalities. The bottom-up approach of addressing specific externalities with regulations creates a difficult situation for businesses who must understand the potential impact of where these risks occur upstream in their supply chain, and how to demonstrate compliance for those downstream stakeholders. 3, ESG is emerging as a tool set for how to understand and manage your organization's exposure to these externalities in your supply chain in order to meet the requirements of your company and/or downstream stakeholders. It has the ability to provide a foundation to assess risk and performance of suppliers in key impact areas and areas where non-financial risks tend to occur, as well as lay a foundation for continuous management and improvement. And finally, because of the complicated, constantly shifting landscape of regulations and stakeholder requirements regarding sustainability, and the groundwork needed to move beyond reacting to compliance requirements to more proactively engage with your supply chain holistically, if you're not using this as an opportunity to get ahead today, you will fall behind. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Devin. I'm just sneaking up on you from the other side of the stage because it's so huge. I've got all this room to play with. Okay, thank you. Now, obviously, this is the first session of the day, so just to remind you, if you do have any questions, if you want to put a hand up, and we do have some microphones that we can bring round. So, are there any questions at this stage? Can't see any hands shooting up. Okay, I'll take some questions that have come in from our virtual audience as well. Now, I have read in some media, not BizClick's media, of course, there has been some criticism of ESG. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so when it comes to criticisms of ESG, I want to think about not letting perfect be the enemy of good, right? How long has it taken us to get to generally accepted accounting principles globally? We're working at it for, 50 years now? So ESG, this is all new. These are going to grow and evolve over time, and that's why I wanted to pull the conversation back to sustainability as the ultimate goal. ESG isn't the why, ESG is the how. It's going to help us measure and improve performance over time, but the why comes back to that sustainability piece.
Okay. And another question that's come in here says, a lot of these new and existing regulations don't affect my business today, so why should I be thinking about possible impacts in my supply chain right now?
Just because it's not affecting you today doesn't mean it won't tomorrow. And the idea of holistically managing on these topics is to put yourself in a better position moving forward to manage change as it comes.
And change by its very nature is unpredictable, right? Which we've certainly seen in the last couple of years. So is it a case of trying to just get ahead of those incoming regulations? Getting ahead of what you can get ahead of, because there's always going to be some curveballs appear from somewhere.
Exactly. So the idea of using ESG as that criteria to help you kind of set a baseline in the areas that we know and understand to be these areas of risk that tend to be the subject of these upcoming regulations, it will at least put you in a better position to respond to things as they come up.
Okay, last chance for any questions from the audience. Can't see a hand going up there. Okay, well, we'll conclude that session then. Thank you very much. Thank you, Devin.
Thank you.